I had spent the entire morning convincing myself that the moment I had been preparing for was supposed to feel triumphant. The kind of moment a man waits decades to earn after building something from nothing, turning late nights and quiet sacrifices into a company the world could point to and say, that came from him, and I kept repeating that thought to steady my hands because the conference room was already set up, the papers were already arranged, the lawyers were already waiting, and the entire future of the empire I had carried on, my shoulders for half a lifetime, now rested on a single signature that would shift everything from me to the one person I believed would honor it. But beneath the polished surface of that belief, something inside me trembled, a quiet warning. I kept brushing aside because parents are supposed to trust their children, supposed to see the best in them, even when the truth is whispering from the corners and dark. I tried so hard to silence that whisper as I stood there, staring at the glossy folders embossed with the weight of billions and legacy and expectation, and the faint reflection of a man who looked too tired to pretend confidence anymore. And when I finally lowered myself into the leather chair, felt that strange tightness in my chest, the kind that tells the world is about to tilt, even if you don't know how or why. And I reached for my pen just as the phone in my pocket buzzed once, sharp enough to slice straight through the tension in the air, and I almost ignored it, almost let it go, because no message should matter in a moment like that. But something in the vibration felt wrong too. Quick, too urgent, too precise. And when I pulled the phone out and saw the preview of the message, my breath collapsed in on itself, because it was a single line from an anonymous #1 sentence that froze everything in my veins. "Don't sign anything, your son is not ready." And I stared at the screen, unable to blink, because the words throbbed with the kind of truth that comes from someone who has nothing to gain and everything to reveal, and the walls around me seemed to pull inward as the echo of the message pushed every buried doubt back to the surface. Every strange moment, every uneasy shift, every time my son hesitated when I asked simple questions, every flicker of something cold in his eyes that never used to live there, and suddenly every piece of the world I thought I understood began to feel unstable, and I stepped out of the room, pretending I needed a moment to clear my thoughts. But in reality I was drowning in them, because the message wasn't random, it wasn't vague, it came from someone who knew something, someone who had seen something, someone who believed I was walking into a trap I didn't know existed, and the memory of the last time I saw my son. Before this meeting clawed at my mind, the way he kept checking his phone, the way he flinched when a notification came in, the way he avoided looking me directly in the eyes, the way he spoke in polished, rehearsed answers, and the way the woman beside him watched every word like she was monitoring him, like she was adjusting him, like she was editing him in real time. And back then I convinced myself it was nothing, convinced myself grief and pressure had simply worn him thin. But now, standing alone in the hallway with that single warning burning in my hand, I knew it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of something I refused to see, and everything inside me started unraveling, because the company I built was not just numbers and buildings, it was my life's breath, my wife's faith, my family's future, and I had been ready to hand it over without question, without hesitation, without knowing whether the person receiving it was still son I raised, or a man reshaped by someone else's ambition. And as I stood there, the memory of my wife rose so sharply it almost bent me, the way she would rest her hand on my arm and tell me to trust my instincts, not my fear. And the instinct rising now was not subtle, not gentle. It was a roar telling me to open my eyes before everything shattered, and I felt a cold trembling settle into my bones as I scrolled down and saw the second message, 3 words that hollowed me out. "He's being controlled." And the hallway spun for a moment, because those words pierced straight through every denial I had clung to and forced me to confront the truth. I never wanted to even imagine that the boy I once lifted onto my shoulders, the boy who once clutched my hand at every school performance, the boy who once cried into my chest when he dreamed of losing me, was now a man tangled in someone else's grip, someone who saw him not as a person, but as a key, a pathway, a gateway to everything I had built. And I pressed the phone to my chest, trying to steady myself, but the ground kept shifting, because if that message was true, then this wasn't just a mistake, it wasn't just poor judgment, it was betrayal, mixed with desperation, mixed with danger. And when I finally forced myself to breathe, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I could not walk back into that room pretending nothing had changed, because everything had changed, and the signature that once felt like a future now felt like a sentence. And as I closed my eyes, I felt the echo of that warning settle into me like a blade, and I knew the next step I took would determine not just the fate of the company, but the fate of my son, the fate of the last piece of family I still had left. I walked back into the conference room, but everything felt wrong, heavier, sharper, as if the air itself had shifted while I was gone, and the lawyers were still seated with their patient smiles and practiced calm, ready to hand me documents, worth more than anything I owned in this world. But my son was nowhere to be seen, and that absence hit me like a blow to the ribs, because he was supposed to be here. He was supposed to stand beside me. He was supposed to look me in the eye as I handed over the future, built from every sacrifice I ever made. And instead I found myself holding a phone that vibrated, once more in my palm, with a third message that made my throat close the moment I read it. Making him sign things behind your back, and I felt my heart stumble out of rhythm, because nothing in this world prepares a parent for the realization that someone else has their hands on your child's choices, twisting them, pushing them, shaping them. And I told the lawyers I needed time, told them I needed to step away again, told them I was not ready, and they exchanged looks, the kind people exchange when they know something they shouldn't know, when they know more than they say. And that made the fear coil tighter inside me, winding like barbed wire until I could barely swallow. And when I stepped outside again, the hallway felt darker, longer, colder, and I dialed his number because I needed to hear. His voice needed to hear something real from him. But it rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail, and the sound of his recorded greeting cracked something inside me, because he sounded so alive in that message, so certain, so untouched by whatever had been pulling him away these past months. And before I could gather myself, the elevator pinged behind me, and there he was, stepping out with the woman at his side, moving as one unit, their expressions matching in that unsettling, rehearsed kind of calm. And the moment she saw me, she tightened her grip on his arm in a way so small, so quick, that anyone else would have missed it. But I didn't. I saw it, I felt it, and I knew that gesture wasn't affection, it was possession. And he smiled a strained, brittle smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said he was ready to begin, ready to finalize, ready to take on everything I had spent my life building. And I studied him quietly, because something in his face had changed, a hollowing, a tension, a flicker of fear barely hidden under the surface. And she stepped forward, answering for him before he could take another breath, telling me the documents were already being reviewed, telling me that delaying any further would look weak to the board, telling me that trust was necessary at a time like this, telling me he was prepared, even though the messages in my phone insisted the opposite. And I asked him directly, "Are you ready?" And there was a split second, a moment so fragile I almost imagined it, where his eyes flickered with panic, a tremor of truth rising up through whatever script she had drilled into him. But before he could speak, she cut him off, sliding between us like a shield, insisting that we proceed. And he lowered his gaze the way someone lowers their head under a weight too heavy to lift. And something in me began to fracture, because I recognized the look, exhaustion, confusion, desperation, the quiet drowning of a person who no longer knew where their own thoughts ended and someone else's began. And the more I studied him, the more pieces clicked into place, the strange decisions, the missed meetings, the erratic messages, the sudden coldness, the vanishing warmth, the way he always checked with her before answering even simple questions. And the realization hit with a force that almost staggered me. Someone had gotten into my son's mind. Someone had planted doubts. Someone had fanned his insecurities. Someone had convinced him he was nothing without them, and everything with them. Someone had taught him to view me as an obstacle instead of a foundation. And when she suggested we go sign immediately, her voice dripping with the kind of sugary dominance she used to coat her commands, I took a long, slow breath, because every instinct inside me screamed to obey, screamed to sign, screamed to make him happy, screamed to keep the peace. But beneath that panic there was another voice, quieter, older, stronger, the voice of every instinct that had ever kept my family alive. And I asked him again, looking only at him, not her, Do you want this? And she stiffened as if the question itself was an attack, and he faltered this time, the hesitation longer, heavier, more visible, and he swallowed hard before answering, I think it's what we're supposed to do, and that word, we burned into me like fire, and I knew then this wasn't about legacy or leadership or business. This was about influence, pressure, control. This was about someone reshaping him in their own image and using my signature to cement their power over him. And I stepped back because the world had tilted too far, and she immediately filled the space, stepping closer, her voice softer now but colder in truth, telling me I was overthinking, telling me I was making things harder, telling me he needed this, telling me he was chosen for this, telling me that if I didn't trust him he would never forgive me. And I saw the flare of fear in his eyes at her words, not fear of me, fear of her, fear of what she would say to him later, fear of what she would take away from him, fear of what she would accuse him of if he did not follow her script perfectly. And something hardened inside me, as old as fatherhood itself, the instinct to protect not just from outside threats, but from the ones that smile while they cut. And I said I needed another day, and she laughed, a brittle, humorless sound that grated like glass, insisting there was no time, insisting the board would panic, insisting delays would ruin everything, insisting that this was his destiny. And he looked between us, torn, fraying, unraveling, and I saw in that moment how deeply she had her hand around his life, around his identity, around his fear. And the crushing realization washed over me that if I signed those papers, she wouldn't just have influence, she'd have the entire kingdom wrapped around her. Fingers and every part of my son that still belonged to him would disappear into her shadow. And as she kept speaking, pushing, pressing, demanding my decision, I felt something inside me snap into clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives when someone threatens not just your legacy, but your child's soul. And I told her calm and controlled that the decision was mine and mine alone, and she froze, the cold fury leaking through the cracks of her smile before she grabbed his arm again, nails digging into his sleeve, and whispered something sharp and low into his ear that made him flinch. And when she turned back, her voice was sugar dipped in venom, telling me I was making a mistake, telling me he was ready, telling me that hesitation meant weakness. And I realized then that this wasn't pressure, this was strategy. This was someone trying to steer an empire, using my son as the reins. And no matter how much I loved him, no matter how much he begged, no matter how much he believed he needed her, I could not allow someone else to take everything I built and weaponize it through him, and I stepped back from both of them as the truth settled, cold and unmovable inside me. The next move I made would either save him or lose him, and I had no idea which outcome waited on the other side. I drove home that night with my hands locked around the steering wheel so tightly the tendons burned, because the truth had finally broken through the fog I had been pretending not to see, and every mile of road felt like a blade cutting deeper into the realization that the person walking beside my son, the person whispering into his ear, the person who smiled with that polished, cold sweetness, was not a partner, not a supporter, not someone who cared about his party's future. She was a force that saw him as a vessel, as a doorway, as a tool, and I had been seconds away from placing the entire weight of my life into her hands. And the closer I got to home, the more the exhaustion turned into something sharper, something braced, something ready. And when I finally stepped into the house, the silence felt like it pressed both hands against my chest, urging me to breathe, urging me to stay standing, urging me to steady myself, because the next steps would not be gentle, they would not be easy, they would not be clean. And I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark room as if waiting for the answers to rise out of the air. But all I saw was the memory of my son's eyes, flickering between fear and obligation, between wanting to speak and being terrified of the consequences, between wanting to be free and being loyal to the very person holding him captive. And I kept replaying his voice in that cafe weeks earlier, how he trembled, how he tried to sound strong, how every word echoed with the tension of someone who had forgotten where his own desires ended and someone else's began. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt the weight of guilt pressing down on me, because I had raised him to trust too easily, raised him to see the good in people, raised him to lead with softness, and now that softness had been turned into a doorway for someone who knew exactly how to step through it without leaving footprints, and sometime, past midnight, after hours of sitting in that same position, staring at nothing, I finally forced myself to stand and walk to the office, where the old drawers creaked open, the way they always had, revealing years of notes, years of plans, years of letters from my wife, reminders of what mattered, what we built, what we protected, and reading her handwriting hit me so hard I had to close my eyes, because she always warned me. She always said kindness without boundaries becomes a weakness in the wrong hands, and I never thought our son would be the one to fall into those hands. And the next morning, the storm began exactly the way I knew it would, the phone vibrating so violently it nearly slid off the table. And the moment I answered, his voice tumbled out fast, panicked, sharp, asking why I left, asking why I delayed, asking why I didn't trust him, asking why I kept complicating things, and behind him I could hear her tight, controlled breathing, like she was leaning toward the phone, listening, calculating, waiting for the moment to strike. And I told him I just needed more time, told him I wasn't ready to sign, told him there were things he needed to understand first. And hearing that seemed to break something, because he began talking so quickly. His words tangled into each other like he was trying to outrun them, and he kept saying that everyone was watching him, everyone was expecting him to step up, everyone was waiting for him to take control, and that if I didn't sign now, if I didn't trust him now, if I didn't support him now, he would lose everything. And when he said everything, the sound cracked like glass, as if he was not just talking about the company but about her, about the approval she dangled above him like a reward, like oxygen, like the only proof that he mattered. And when she finally grabbed the phone, her voice came through like a blade dipped in honey, asking me why I was sabotaging him, why I was making him crawl, why I was tearing down his confidence, why I was refusing to let him grow, why I was treating him like a child. And I didn't trust my voice enough to answer, because rage had begun to burn slowly in the hollows of my ribs. Rage not at her, not at him, but at myself, for letting this happen, for missing the signs, for believing he was strong enough to withstand someone like her, someone who built her life by hollowing out others and filling them with her own ambition. And after she finished her tirade, he came back on the line, quieter this time, like someone swallowed by shame, and he asked me a question that nearly brought me to my knees. Why don't you believe in me? And I wanted to shout that I did, that I always had, that I had believed in him more than I believed in myself. But I couldn't lie. I couldn't let love blind me again. And instead, I told him the truth, that I didn't believe in the person speaking on the phone, because it wasn't him. And the silence that followed felt like the earth tilting into darkness. And he whispered, then barely audible, "She said, you'd say that. She said you'd try to turn me against her. She said you'd panic. She said you'd make this harder. She said you were threatened by her. She said you'd destroy everything. She said you were never going to let me lead." And it was in that moment that every fear I had been pushing aside solidified into certainty. She had been telling him these things, spoon-feeding him poison long enough that he had begun to swallow them as truth, long enough that the foundation between us had begun to erode, long enough that love alone would not save him. And I felt something inside me go still, not cold, not dead, just still. The way a parent becomes still when they finally understand the shape of the danger their child is walking toward. And he kept talking, saying he needed this, saying he deserved this, saying he had to prove himself, saying he was tired of being seen as fragile, weak, dependent. And when his voice broke again, finally understood the core of it. He wasn't greedy, he wasn't cruel, he was lost, he was afraid. He was clinging to the only person who made him feel powerful, even if she was the same person who had been carving pieces off him for months. And I told him then calmly, painfully, that I loved him, but I would not sign, not today, not tomorrow, not until I knew he was speaking with his own voice and not hers. And that answer pushed him into panic, raw, desperate panic, because he wasn't just afraid of losing the opportunity, he was afraid of what we would do to him when she heard. And he tried to cover it, tried to hide it, tried to pretend, but I heard the quiver, the dread, the tightly controlled breath, and when he abruptly hung up, the silence felt like a door slamming shut inside both of us. And the following hours were worse. The messages rapid, scattered, angry, frightened, some in his tone, some in hers, some written to wound, some written to beg all, written to confuse, and as they poured in I realized I was no longer fighting for the company. I was fighting for my son's mind, his identity, his life, and the late afternoon light slanted through the windows as if trying to offer warmth, but I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't respond because I was finally beginning to understand the scale of what I was up against, and I knew that the next time he appeared before me, he would not come as my son, he would come as someone sculpted by her voice, someone fueled by her expectations, someone ready to tear down everything I built if it meant proving his loyalty to her. And I also knew that when that moment came I would have to decide whether to protect my legacy or protect him, and the truth that terrified me most was realizing I might not be able to save both. The next morning arrived like a blow to the ribs, sharp, sudden, leaving me breathless before I even opened my eyes, and the air in the house felt heavier than sleep itself, as if everything inside these walls already knew what was coming, before I had the strength to admit it, and I moved slowly through the rooms, listening to the quiet, trying to anchor myself in something solid, something familiar, something untouched by the chaos that had begun tightening around my son's life and bleeding into mine. And as the sun crawled up the edge of the horizon, my phone lit up again, vibrating against the counter with the same frantic rhythm that had become too familiar. Messages flooding in, messages from him, messages from her, messages written in the same frantic script of fear and blame and urgency, and I didn't open a single one because I already knew the pattern, already knew the shift from begging to demanding, from demanding to accusing, from accusing to tearing, and nothing in those words would be new. Nothing would change, the truth growing sharper inside me, and I stepped outside to breathe, but even the air felt tense, as if the wind itself was holding its breath for the moment. Everything snapped, and around noon the doorbell rang, once loud enough to echo through my ribs, and when I opened the door he was standing there, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, eyes darting around like he was tracking invisible threats, and behind him she stood with that same polished stillness, the stillness of a predator watching for weakness. And I felt the heaviness settle deeper into my spine because I knew this wasn't a visit, this was an attack wrapped in the shape of concern. And he pushed past me without waiting for permission, pacing the living room like he couldn't control his own limbs, while she remained by the doorway, arms crossed, expression sharp and triumphant, like she had already won something I hadn't realized I was fighting for. And he demanded to know why I was hesitating, why I didn't trust him, why I always doubted him, why I refused to let him grow, why I refused to step aside, and the speed of his words made my chest tighten because they weren't his words, they were hers. Every sentence carried her tone, her rhythm, her venom, her rehearsed strategy, and when I looked at him, really looked, his pupils were blown wide, fear thrumming through him in waves, like someone had wound him too tightly and let go, and I realized then he hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten, he hadn't breathed properly in days because she had pressed into him every hour, every conversation, every moment, telling him that this was do or die, that he had to choose her, that failure meant losing everything, including her. And when I finally asked him calmly to sit down, she snapped her attention to me like a blade turning in the light and told me he didn't need to sit, told me he needed answers, told me I owed him clarity, told me any delay now was selfish and destructive. And he flinched at her tone, flinched like a man used to, shrinking at the slightest shift in her voice, and I felt something inside me rupture because that single flinch told me more truth than every argument we'd had. Combined, she controlled him through fear, not love, and the damage she had inflicted on him was deeper than anything I'd allowed myself to comprehend. And he began pacing again, running his hands through his hair, muttering that he couldn't lose this, couldn't lose her, couldn't lose his chance, couldn't lose the life she promised him. And each repetition hollowed me further because I could hear it clearly, the loop she drilled into him over and over until it became a cage he couldn't see. And I told him I wasn't saying no forever, I was saying not yet, but she cut across my words again, sharp, vicious, calling me manipulative, saying I was gaslighting him, saying I was jealous of her influence, saying I couldn't stand the idea of him stepping into power. And it was in that moment the fear in my son's eyes shifted into something worse, something like panic rising too fast to contain. And he grabbed the back of a chair, gripping it so hard, muscles in his forearms trembled, and he begged me, begged, with a voice so broken it barely held shape, saying he needed this, saying he was falling apart, saying he didn't know what was real anymore, saying she was the only person who believed in him, saying I was driving him to choose between us, saying he couldn't survive, losing either one, and she stepped forward, then sliding her hand up his arm with a gentleness so intentional it made my skin crawl, whispering, just loud enough that I could hear him, "You see what he's doing? He's manipulating you. He wants control, he wants to trap you." And he shook his head violently, saying, "No, no, no." But even I could tell he didn't know what he was denying anymore, and the worst part was the way his breathing changed short, frantic, uneven, like someone drowning while still standing on solid ground. And he stumbled back, dropping into the nearest chair, hands trembling, breath breaking. And she didn't comfort him, she didn't kneel, she didn't touch him, she just watched him unravel like she was studying the weakness inside him, calculating how to use it. And something inside me rose hot, fierce, heavy, the instinct to protect him, not from life, not from failure, but from her, from the way she dismantled him piece by piece, turning his longing into fear, his fear into obedience, his obedience into dependence. And I told him gently that he needed help, real help, not from her, not from me, but from professionals, from someone who could untangle the knots she had tied around his mind. And she laughed, that cold, humorless laugh, dripping with mockery, accusing me of calling him crazy, accusing me of disrespecting him, accusing me of trying to isolate him the way she isolated him, from every friend he ever had, from every colleague, from every person who might have offered him truth instead of worship. And she began listing everything she claimed. I'd done wrong every time, she said. I had undermined him, every flaw. She said I passed down to him, every failure she said he inherited from me. And I watched him crumble under each blow because he believed her. He believed everything she said, even as it shattered him, and he finally shouted, "Stop." But didn't she only grew louder, more vicious, more relentless. And he sank his head into his hands, whispering, "Please just stop, both of you. Please stop. I can't think. I can't breathe. I can't do this." And that admission cut the room open like a wound. Because he wasn't choosing her, he wasn't choosing me, he wasn't choosing anything he was breaking, and she didn't care. And I realized then with a clarity that struck like lightning that the only way to save him was to step completely out of her reach, even if it meant losing him entirely, even if it meant letting him walk away, because right now I wasn't the one hurting him, she was. And as long as I stayed in the line of fire, she would keep using me to destroy him piece by piece until nothing remained but the version she wanted. And when she yanked him up from the chair, pulling him toward the door like a puppet, he followed, not because he chose her, but because he had nothing left inside to resist. And as the door slammed behind them, the echo ran through the house like something breaking deep underground, and I stood there in the aftermath, trembling with the truth that the next time I saw him, he would be worse, and the next time she spoke through him, her goal would be total control, not negotiation. And I knew what I had to do, something final, something irreversible, something that would tear my heart open but maybe save his life. And I sank into the chair he had just sat in, feeling the warmth he left behind, fading quickly, and whispered into the empty room, "I won't let her destroy you, even if you hate me for the rest of your life." The morning after they tore out of the driveway, the house felt strangely hollow, like someone had scooped out the center of it and left only the shell behind, and I moved through the rooms, touching chair backs, door frames, tabletops, as if reminding myself that something in this world was still real, still solid, still mine, and every shadow in the house carried the echo of his voice, trembling, begging, unraveling, while she stood over him, feeding his panic like fuel. And I kept hearing him whisper, "I can't breathe," over and over, like the words had carved themselves into the inside of my skull. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized how close he was to breaking in a way that could not be undone, and how deeply she intended to use that break, cement her control. And as I drank coffee, I couldn't taste. I stared at the phone, waiting for the storm I knew was coming, because people like her never retreat. They regroup, they sharpen, they strategize, they strike harder the next time. And right on cue, the screen lit up, not with calls, not with messages, but with a single notification from my advisor asking if I still intended to sign the transfer. because someone had reached out claiming they represented me, someone requesting early access, someone pushing aggressively for immediate authorization, and the moment I saw it, the coffee turned sour in my throat because I knew exactly who would do that, who would impersonate, who would forge, who would push, who would carve her way through legal walls, using his name and my silence as leverage. And I called the advisor instantly, telling her, no, telling her, absolutely not, telling her under no circumstances should anything be processed without my voice on the line. And even as I spoke, my voice wavered, because the truth was tightening around me quickly. If she was willing to attempt this while he was unraveling in my living room, she would be willing to go even further, and the advisor said something that pierced deeper than I wanted it to. She said, someone is trying to move faster than you, and I hung up and stood in the center of the kitchen, staring at nothing while dread crawled up the back of my neck, because it meant she had escalated. It meant he was preparing to burn everything down. If she couldn't control him through emotion, she would control him through paperwork, money, titles, leverage, and he would follow, because fear had rewired him into someone who could not breathe without her voice guiding him. And I knew then, with a clarity that tasted like blood, that I had to remove the option entirely, not for her, not even for myself, but for him. Because as long as that company existed, as long as the transfer remained possible, she would use it like a choke chain around his throat, and he would stay loyal to her, no matter how much it crushed him. And once the idea took shape, it terrified me, because it meant letting go of everything I had built, everything my wife believed in, everything my life had been shaped around. But the truth hit me so cleanly. It almost steadied me. He mattered more than the company, and if I clung to the empire, I would lose him completely, because she would drag him into that world with teeth bared, and I would watch him disappear into her shadow like a man, swallowed whole by someone else's ambition. And so I sat down at the table, pulled the documents toward me, the ones that had been waiting for months, the ones I'd avoided, the ones that represented the knife I never wanted to hold. And I read through every line slowly, deliberately, until I found the clause, the one option I never thought I would consider: dissolving the transfer, restructuring ownership, blocking access, locking everything down so tightly that even he wouldn't be able to pry open the door no matter how hard she pushed. And my hands trembled, not from fear but from the grief rising like a tide inside me, because choosing this meant choosing the role of villain in his eyes, choosing the role she had been preparing him to see, choosing the version of Tavile. Me she wanted him to hate, but it was the only way to save him. Not from her, not from the world, but from himself, from the part of him that believed he needed her, that he was nothing without her, that he was worthless without her validation. And when I signed the first set of documents, my chest tightened so sharply I had to brace a hand against the table because it felt like cutting off my own limb. But the deeper truth rose through the pain like a slow tide. If I didn't do it, she would take everything, including him, and there would be no coming back after that. And I spent the whole afternoon on calls, filing blocks, escalating, protections, locking down accounts, freezing the transfer, notifying the board. And with every confirmation, every digital signature, every locked door, I felt the future bending into a shape I had not planned, but could no longer avoid. And when all of it was finally done, when the last safeguard clicked into place, I felt a strange, terrifying quiet settle inside me. Not relief, not triumph, something heavier, something like finality. And as evening fell and the sun bled across the horizon, I walked through the house, touching the photos on the wall, lingering on one of him as a child, standing beside me, hands covered in dirt, smiling wide and fearless, and my throat clenched because that version of him felt worlds away, now buried under months of pressure and manipulation, until only fragments of him peeked through in moments of panic and despair, and the grief crashed over me. Then grief for the man he had become, grief for the man he might still become, grief for the son I was losing, grief for the father I had been, grief for the future he almost walked into, because he thought it would make him whole, and I let it wash through me fully because I knew that soon, too soon, he would come back, not broken, not begging, but furious, because she would twist this into betrayal. She would feed him lines about sabotage. She would tell him I was destroying his life. She would convince him I never trusted him, and I would stand there knowing she was the one dismantling him, piece by piece, and I would have to endure his anger, knowing it was the only way he had a chance at rebuilding himself without her claws in his spine. And when the first message finally appeared on my screen, a single line from him written in a tone so sharp it didn't even sound like him. "What did you do?" I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes because the war I had been avoiding was now here, and I whispered into the quiet room, a promise only a father would understand. "One day you'll see why I had to do it, even if today it destroys us both." The knock came hours later, the kind of knock that doesn't wait to be welcomed, the kind that belongs to someone fueled not by clarity, but by panic and fury, tangled into one. And when I opened the door, he stood there, shaking not from cold, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything, collapsing at once. And behind him she hovered like a shadow, carved from ice, eyes burning with the kind of rage only found in people who have lost control of a puppet they believed they owned. And the moment he stepped into the house, he demanded to know why I had done it, why I had sabotaged his life, why I had ripped the ground out from under him, and his voice cracked under the strain, trembling on the edge of breaking. And before I could answer, she pushed past him, her words slicing through the air, accusing me of destroying his future, accusing me of being threatened, accusing me of wanting him small and dependent, accusing me of being jealous of her influence. And I stood there, letting her words spill like poison, because none of it was truth, none of it came from him. It all came from the script she had written long before this moment. And he turned to me again, eyes frantic, hands shaking, asking what he was supposed to do now that everything had been locked down, asking how he was supposed to prove himself, asking how he was supposed to build anything if I kept blocking him. And the pain in his voice hit harder than any accusation, because it came from the same place I had been fighting to reach, the small, hidden part of him that still believed he wasn't enough. And she saw that opening instantly, stepping between us, pressing her palm against his chest, whispering loud enough for me to hear, "He did this to punish you. This is who he really is. This is why you need me." And I watched her manipulate his fear as easily as breathing, twisting reality in real time, shaping the moment to fit her narrative, forcing him deeper into the panic she fed him every day until he mistook her voice for his own truth. And he grabbed his hair, pulling at it like his skull hurt, like the spinning inside him had become too much, and he shouted that he couldn't do this anymore, that he couldn't handle being torn apart by the two people he cared about. And she leaned toward him again, whispering something I couldn't hear, but whatever it was, it made him flinch as if stung, and I realized with a cold hollowness she had conditioned him to fear displeasing her, that every time he questioned her, every time he hesitated, every time he expressed doubt, she punished him with silence, withdrawal, contempt. And he had internalized that cycle so deeply he no longer knew how to move without her approval. And when I tried to speak, she turned on me instantly, unleashing a torrent of venom, telling him I was lying, telling him I wanted him under my thumb, telling him he would never grow while I existed, telling him he would never be respected until he cut me out completely. And he collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, whispering, "I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know who to believe. I don't know who I am without someone telling me." And hearing that nearly brought me to my knees, because it was the truth he had been hiding for months, the truth she had taken advantage of, the truth he was finally admitting now that everything had fallen apart. And I walked toward him slowly, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal, terrified of being touched. And I told him softly that he didn't need to believe either of us, not now, not today, that he needed to breathe, that he needed space, that he needed to separate his thoughts from hers, that he needed help, not judgment, not pressure, not threats. And she exploded at that word help, screaming that I was calling him broken, screaming that I was undermining him, screaming that he didn't need anyone but her, screaming that I was trying to poison him against her. And he jolted at her voice, covering his ears, shaking his head, begging her to stop, begging both of us to stop. And I stepped back, hands raised, not in surrender, but in recognition that any wrong word from me would push him further into her grasp. And she knew it. She could smell the fragility on him like blood in the water, and she pressed closer, whispering that she was the only one who understood him, that she was the only one who believed in him, that she was the only one who saw his potential. and I watched him crumble under that weight until finally something inside him snapped, not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet, raw, breaking sound, as he whispered, "Please stop talking to me like I'm a child." And her face froze, the mask slipping, the fury underneath sizzling through. "And she?" he asked him slowly. "What did you say?" And he repeated it, the voice trembling but steady enough. "Stop talking for me, stop deciding for me, stop dragging me. I need to breathe." And the shift in her expression was immediate, frightening, the cold withdrawal of someone whose control had been threatened. And she stepped back, eyes narrowing before she turned, that venom back toward me, telling him, "This is your fault. This is what he wants. He wants you confused. He wants you weak. He wants you to need him." And for the first time, he shook his head. No, small, barely visible, but real. And that single movement changed everything, because she saw in that instant, leash she had wrapped around him had slipped, and she launched into a tirade, screaming that he was choosing the wrong side, screaming that he was throwing away everything she had built, screaming that he was ungrateful, screaming that he was pathetic. And he finally broke, shouting, "Stop!" And the silence that followed was thick, electric, final, and she stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, someone she no longer fully controlled, someone slipping out of her orbit. And she spat out that she was done, spat out that he would regret this, spat out that he was nothing without her, and stormed toward the door, slamming it so hard the frame shook, and my son collapsed into the couch, trembling, shoulders lifted like he was bracing for another blow that never came. And I sat beside him slowly, not touching, not speaking, until the shaking eased, and he whispered, "She's gone," like he didn't believe it, like he expected her to burst back in. And I told him quietly that she might come back, but the hold she had over him had fractured, and that fracture mattered. That fracture was the doorway out, and he turned his face toward me, eyes swollen, voice hoarse, and whispered, "I don't know who I am without her." And I felt my chest ache, because rebuilding yourself after being consumed is the hardest thing a person can do. And I told him gently, painfully, honestly, that he wouldn't find himself overnight, not in a week, not in a month, that he would feel lost, that he would feel empty, that he would feel afraid. But that emptiness was not a punishment, it was the space where his real self could grow again. And he began to cry, the kind of crying that comes from a place too deep to articulate, shaking sobs that racked his whole body. And I placed a hand over his back, not to guide, not to fix, but simply to let him know he wasn't alone. And he cried until the exhaustion quieted him into stillness, and long after he fell asleep on the couch, I stayed there, sitting in the dim room, listening to his breathing. And I knew the road ahead would be brutal, the healing slow, the shadows long. But for the first time in months, I felt something like real hope, not because she was gone, but because he had finally taken the first step toward becoming someone who could exist without her voice, filling every corner of his mind. And as dawn began to rise through the window, casting thin gold streaks across his face, I whispered to the quiet room a promise I intended to keep. "I will help you rebuild, not into the man she wanted, but into the man you were always meant to become."